my name's Courtney. Bear with me if my screen wobbles a little bit. I have my computer propped up in a really funky manner because my desk was too low for my laptop, so I had to get a little creative. But this week I'm going to be discussing the practice of stop and frisk. So many of you obviously know what stop and frisk is, but it's the practice that's been widely criticized across the country. And it refers to the brief and non-intrusive police stop of a suspect. The Fourth Amendment requires that before stopping the suspect, the police must have a reasonable suspicion that a crime has been, is being, or is about to be committed by a suspect. If the police reasonably suspect that the suspect is armed and dangerous, then they can stop, frisk the suspect, and give a quick pat down of their outer layer of clothing. But that tends to lead to other issues, which I'm not going to talk about. The frisk is also called a Terry stop, and that comes from a Supreme Court case, Terry versus Ohio, that took place in 1968. That was saying that a stop and frisk must comply with the Fourth Amendment, meaning that it cannot be unreasonable. So a reasonable stop and frisk is one in which a reasonably prudent officer is warranted in the circumstances of giving a case and believing that his safety or the safety of others is endangered, and that they may make a reasonable search for weapons on the person if they believe them to be armed and dangerous. Just remember that they're to believe that this person is armed and dangerous. The verbiage changes a bit throughout history, and they add a little addendums to the policies surrounding these practices. So in 2015, there was a court case, Rodriguez versus United States, and the Supreme Court held that a police stop exceeding the time needed to handle the matter for which the stop was made violates the Constitution's shield against unreasonable seizures. A seizure justified only by a police-observed traffic violation becomes unlawful if it's prolonged by the time reasonably required to commit the mission of issuing a ticket for the violation. Specifically, in this case, a police officer had completed his stop, done everything he was supposed to, but then he had his police dog perform a sniff search on the suspect, and the court determined that the sniff search violated the Fourth Amendment as it was prolonged by the time reasonable required to complete the stop. So, these practices sound great in theory to most people, but there are a lot of issues that stem from them. So there's one state in particular that is widely known for their stop and frisk policies, and if you didn't already know, that's New York. There was a reporting that said that there have been 5 million stop and frisks since 2002, and that the Black and Latinx communities continue to be the overwhelming target of these tactics. Nearly 9 out of 10 stop and frisk New Yorkers have been completely innocent. So even though the numbers are decreasing through the years, there are certain years that I'm going to focus on that have terrifying numbers that had been recorded, but I like to note that these are just the ones that have been recorded. So in 2011, there were over 685,000 NYPD stops recorded. 605,000 were innocent, and that's 88%. 350,000 were Black at 53%. 223,000 were Latinx at 34%. 61,000 were white at 9%. And 341 were aged between 14 and 21 at more than half of those stops. So almost all of those stopped were minority males, and that percentage is 90%. And the vast majority of the stops uncovered no evidence of wrongdoing, and that percentage, like previously mentioned, was 88%. So given these numbers, it's not surprising that in August of 2013, a federal judge ruled that the New York Police Department's use of mass stop and frisk tactics violated the Constitution. So I'm going to bring it a little current. They don't have all of the data for 2019 up yet, obviously, because the year's not over. So I'm going to go with 2018's. So in 2018, there was obviously a huge change, and there was only 11,000 stop and frisk recorded. Of those, 7,000 were innocent at about 70%. Of the 11,000 frisks, 6,000 of them were Black, totaling more than 50%. 3,000 were Latinx at 31%, and only 1,000 were white at 10%. So this might not seem problematic to you, but the issue stems is there's extreme racial profiling that takes place in these practices. 4.4 million stops between January in 2012 is incredibly problematic. Of those stops, only 6% resulted in arrest and 6% resulted in summons. So, in other words, 88% of 4.4 million people had no further action. So, a vast majority of them did absolutely nothing wrong. Only 1.5% found weapons, and in about 83% of the cases, the person stopped was a Black or Hispanic, even though the two groups accounted for just over half of the population. So, bringing it forward, it obviously is a violation of the 14th Amendment because inescapable resource constraints dictate reliance on demographic profiles, including race, to narrow the program scope. As a result, stop and frisk will always be available to individual police officers as a crime-fighting tactic, but these strategies are based on massive applications of stop and frisks, and they can't lawfully be sustained in New York or any other American jurisdiction, at least absent of dramatic shifts in long-standing constitutional doctrine. And to reduce the resource costs, the officers limited the scope of widespread stop and frisk in two ways, both geographically and demographically. Geographically, they targeted, hotspots, areas of statistically high crime determined by CompStat, which is a whole other, problem in its own. And the second shortcut they used was indirect profiling by age, gender, and obviously race. Again, the theory matched its practice, so the stop and frisk was designed to deter gun violence, but officers were acting rationally by tailoring the limited reservoir of stops to the generic demographic characteristics of gun crime suspects, which tends to be the African American population. Obviously, not all police officers were doing this, but the vast majority were. So eventually, there were enough complaints regarding it that it went to a civil trial, and after a 9-week civil trial, Judge Shira Schindelin of the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York declared that the stop and frisk policy was unconstitutional. In New York, stop and frisk had been scaled back considerably after she forced them to change its policies a few years ago. There's been no corresponding upsurge in violence. Actually, there's been a decrease in violent crime. And she was quoted saying it wasn't an effective practice, it didn't stop crime, and the police and the community are now interacting better because the community is less suspicious of the police and don't think that they're going to be at all. Bear with me, I'm so sorry. My computer cut me off at 8 minutes and I'm not recording 8 minutes worth again, so I'm just going to have to attach a second video and hope that it connects, and if not, I'm sorry that you had to watch 2 separate videos. But I'm going to roll into the ethical frameworks and different ethical practices and whatnot. So with these ethical frameworks in mind, it's clear that these practices would violate the moral rights theory. By performing the stop and frisk, you're violating the principles of the right to security of the person, the right to liberty, and the right to privacy. The right to security of the person states that you're not to be subjugated to downgrading treatment or arbitrary arrest, and being stopped and frisked in public is degrading in many ways. I mean, number one, there's people all around and they're watching you, and you're being frisked, and if I'm a female being frisked by a male officer, it could be very uncomfortable. If I'm a transgender person being frisked by, someone of the opposite sex, I could be very uncomfortable. And while I can request a certain officer, there's no telling on how long, and now we're just prolonging the inevitable of me potentially being innocent and just having to go through this whole ordeal. But the overwhelming majority of those people who were frisked were innocent. So despite the tactics and intentions being for those who appear to be committing a crime, they're still stopping innocent people who appear to be guilty. It also violates the right to liberty because it hinders on a person's ability to act legitimately. If I'm stopped in Central Park, for example, and I was told that I was looking suspicious and I want to I have to be frisked, and I get patted down, I'm not gonna want to interact with the police. I'm gonna be unintentional with my interactions in the future. I might become sketchier looking, and because I'm nervous. The search and seizure also would not be warranted because it hinders all interactions that this person may have in the future. I might be traumatically scarred because of this. like interaction. And I know that that's a bit extreme, but you never know the experiences that like someone might have had in the past, and then this could have been the toppling point. And finally, it's a violation of their right to privacy. Being searched inhibits the person's ability to control what information about them is known and what others will know and think about them. You know, just because you're in a public space and you're being searched doesn't mean that there aren't going to be people that you don't know around you. And now you're no longer in control of the information shared about you, because we live in a social media age and so many people record things. So, you know, if that gets on Facebook or some news media source, and now I no longer have the ability to control my own privacy. Next, I will go with utilitarianism. I feel like they would most likely not defend these practices. Those who prescribe to utilitarianism would see this as the happiness of the police and community is greater than those being stopped and frisked. I just realized I said they would not. I mean they will. The police are concerned with getting criminals off the street, which in turn will make the community safe and communities happy. While there may be, you know, advocates and the people who are being searched who are unhappy, I think the good in their mind would outweigh what they are doing and the unhappiness that is related to it. And in the end, I personally believe that Kant would see these practices as the police using these people as a means to an end. The officers using these tools as a way to find criminals hinders the people's ability to accomplish their own legitimate ends. And with moral law in mind, it may be the duty of the officers to stop and search the citizens who they deem to be potentially committing a crime, but it's also hindering in a manner in which they're doing it. So it's no longer considered a duty or obligation. Hopefully this wasn't too boring, and that I would love to hear what you have to think. So thanks.